Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, we're an organization dedicated to policy development and advocacy that's intended to push public institutions to confront concentrated power in support of broad-based prosperity and a robust, inclusive democracy. We have a very full and what's sure to be a fascinating program today, and so I want to get right to it. I'm thrilled to welcome Mike Kubzansky to kick things off for us this afternoon. Mike is the CEO of Omidyar Network, and I think it's fairly difficult to overstate the role that Omidyar has played in building towards a vision of society in which technology works for everybody. I'd be remiss not to note that their role in the ecosystem has been crucial for advancing both the ideas and the strategies that we're now seeing bring about real change. We're grateful to have Omidyar as a partner in this work that is unafraid to speak truth to power, and grateful for the opportunity to hear from Mike at this important juncture. Mike, thanks so much, and the virtual floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. And likewise, I want to thank you, Sarah, and the American Economic Liberties Project for hosting this important and really timely conversation today. Omidyar Network are proud to have been early supporters of American Economic Liberties Project and the mission to address today's crisis of concentrated economic power more generally. For those of you who don't know Omidyar Network, we are a social change venture founded by Pam and Pierre Omidyar. Pierre is the founder of eBay. So we come from business and technology. Silicon Valley is our DNA. And we've seen up close and personal, the power and potential of technology, markets, individuals, and community to make new things possible. We believe deeply in competition and innovation and well-governed markets, and that's how technology improves lives and get better. And in fact, we've invested more than $750 million in startups and tech businesses against that promise and against that hope. So we are fundamentally philanthropists, but we are capitalists and we are technologists. And we believe, frankly, that all three of these need to be fundamentally reimagined. Our current system, as the report will discuss later, has indicated are just not working. And in technology, the rules and the regulations simply have not kept pace with the development of technology. And you see this everywhere. We see in our work, startup rates in America are down 16%. That's not healthy for American dynamism. And so that's the reason we're here today. On October 6th, Chairman Cicilline and the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law released the most comprehensive response from Congress on anti-competitive conduct in the tech sector to date in American history. It's really the first time in more than 50 years that there's been any comprehensive congressional oversight of any relevant economic sector. Tech companies have amassed immense social and political power that is largely unchecked and almost entirely unregulated, and this should make us all pause. It threatens everyday Americans, it threatens small businesses and competitiveness, it threatens workers' rights, our economy, and even our democracy. And this, we believe, requires thoughtful rules of the road to ensure that technology actually works safely, accessibly, and fairly for everybody, and not just for a few. And underneath that, it requires the belief that government is even capable of regulating technology. And so to just take a step back, a canard has been circulating for those of us who travel in Silicon Valley since 2017, when Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress, that somehow government doesn't understand tech, so how could they possibly regulate it? This is a little funny given that the government actually invented the internet, but I think one of the important services, in addition to the substance of this report, is the tremendous leadership of Chairman Cicilline and the committee. They did a real remarkable public service and showed that government can indeed develop a deep understanding of technology and how it needs to be regulated more fully, and really put that false claim to rest. And that became even more clear yesterday when the Department of Justice filed a suit against Google, and the findings were incredibly consistent with the committee's report, as I'm sure we'll be discussing later today. The achievement of a bipartisan consensus on these sets of issues is a massive accomplishment, hard to overstate. And really the work of the committee focused on what consumers, what advertisers, publishers need to thrive in a modern technology economy was groundbreaking. And it showed yet again why competition is so important to everyone's daily lives, to small businesses, and indeed to our guaranteed liberties, economic and otherwise. The subcommittee's 16-month investigation and recommendations have signaled that the time has truly come for a range of things, including strong evidence-based antitrust action, policies that promote competition like interoperability, privacy standards for consumers, a thoughtful approach to tackling disinformation, and a renewed public debate on the harmful behavior by tech companies and their influence on how Americans live, work, learn, and play, and ever more so in the pandemic era. So we are deeply grateful to the committee and to Chairman Cicilline for the new evidence and the roadmap towards restoring competition. It's going to no doubt inspire really thoughtful regulation, accountability, public conversation, and innovation for years to come. So with that, let me flip to today's program. From a regulatory perspective, I'm delighted to announce that FTC Commissioner Rohit Chopra will close today's discussion, as he's done a remarkable job at the FTC changing the approach they're taking on these issues. And first, though, we'll hear from the person who led this effort in the House to tell you more, Chairman David Cicilline. It gives me great pleasure as a former resident of the state of Rhode Island and a proud New Englander to introduce him. He serves Rhode Island's 1st Congressional District and has done so since 2011. He's a senior leader of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. He has attracted really smart and capable minds and talent to public service, to his office, and to the Antitrust Subcommittee that helped generate this report. He's really worked hard to promote innovation and economic opportunity through open and competitive markets. So with that, I'd like to welcome Chairman Cicilline, thank him for his time with us today, and just remind everybody that Sarah will be moderating the conversation. If you've got questions, please put them in the Zoom Q&A or in the chat box. And with that, over to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for that really generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much to the American Economic Liberties Project for the invitation to discuss the House Judiciary Committee's recent report on our investigation of competition in digital markets. Specifically, I also want to thank some of your team here at AELP, particularly Sarah Miller, Matt Stoller, and Sally Hubbard, who were invaluable during this work. Your anti-monopoly expertise and your strong grounding in the history of congressional investigations and a century-long battle between monopoly and democracy were critical as the subcommittee conducted its investigation. And so for that, I'm incredibly grateful. When we began our investigation in June of 2019, I said it was crucial for Congress to reassert its role in economic policymaking. For most of the 20th century, Congress played an active role in shaping competition in the economy by writing and updating the antitrust laws to stop excessive corporate concentration and anti-competitive conduct. But for the past 40 years, Congress has sat idly by as courts warped Congress's intent and antitrust enforcement agencies sat on their hands instead of enforcing the law. Our report is the first step to reversing this trend. Our investigation was bipartisan from the start. Chairman Nadler, myself, then Ranking Member Collins, Ranking Member Sensenbrenner, and members of the subcommittee shared concerns that a small number of dominant, unregulated platform companies had amassed extraordinary power over commerce, communications, and access to information online. We agreed that serious issues had been raised about how Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple have the power and incentives to harm competition warranted an in-depth investigation. And we decided it was important for Congress to investigate the digital marketplace to inform potential legislation. Over 16 months, our investigation documented competition problems in digital markets. We collected evidence and examined whether dominant firms are engaging in anti-competitive conduct. And we assessed whether the existing antitrust laws, competition policy, and levels of enforcement are adequate to address excessive consolidation and anti-competitive conduct. Earlier this month, we released a nearly 450-page report with our findings and recommendations. We found that Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple each serve as a gatekeeper over a key channel of distribution in the digital economy. The evidence we reviewed showed that by controlling access to markets, these companies are able to pick the winners and losers throughout the economy. Not only are they dominant, but the evidence showed that they abuse their dominance by exploiting firms that rely on their platforms and excluding rivals. The evidence also helped us understand that each of these companies uses its gatekeeper power to further entrench their dominance. Their position in the market lets them surveil businesses that use their platform. They use those insights to acquire potential competitors, copy features and services, and cut off rivals. And they all have used their gatekeeper positions to expand their dominance into other lines of business, including engaging in a wide range of anti-competitive conduct, including self-preferencing, tying together products and services, and more. Although there are some differences in the recommendations proposed in our report by some of our Republican colleagues, there is widespread agreement on the facts. We agree that Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple each possess and have abused monopoly power, and in the process, they have harmed competition and consumers. Going forward, the report includes a menu of recommendations for Congress and the antitrust enforcers at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. Our recommendations are rooted in responding to the dominance and anti-competitive and abusive conduct that the investigation uncovered. These recommendations include steps to restore competition to the digital markets by addressing the incentives and ability of dominant platforms to abuse their gatekeeper power, such as through structural separations and prohibitions on certain dominant firms from operating in adjacent lines of business, prohibiting platforms from engaging in self-preferencing, and requiring interoperability and data portability. We also recommend strengthening the antitrust laws. Options include updating Section 7 of the Clayton Act by strengthening the merger enforcement laws to favor competition over consolidation, updating Section 2 of the Sherman Act to prohibit abuses of dominance, and clarifying prohibitions on anti-competitive and harmful conduct, and strengthening overall antitrust enforcement by overriding court decisions that have warped Congress's original intent that the antitrust laws establish a presumption in favor of competition and against monopoly. Last, we recommend reviving antitrust enforcement by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission and eliminating barriers to the private enforcement of the antitrust laws. Our next steps will be to consider legislation in line with the recommendations laid out in the report. We'll continue that work through the lame duck and into the next Congress. Our report and recommendations will be the center of gravity for our agenda to reinvigorate the antitrust laws and antitrust enforcement. Like our investigation, I expect that this process will be bipartisan. As I mentioned before, there is widespread agreement all across the subcommittee that Google, Amazon, Facebook, and who did I miss? Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple have possessed and have abused their monopoly power. Now that we've identified the problem, it's critical that we use all the tools that Congress has, including legislation, granting rulemaking authority, and conducting oversight to start solving this problem for the American people. And in closing, I want to end where I began by thanking AELP again for the invitation to be here today. I look forward to continuing to work with you as we move forward with strengthening our antitrust laws and promoting competition and innovation in the digital markets. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And again, just congratulations on what I think is a historic achievement coming out of your subcommittee at a time when it's just critical to start putting solutions on the table and fighting for them. I think, you know, it's just really been an earthquake in this space, and to see Congress reassert its authority over monopolies and large corporations is a monumental achievement. So thank you so much, and thanks for being with us today. I know you're busy, so I want to jump in with a few questions, both from us that our team put together, and then with a few others that I'm seeing pop up in the chat. One question that we get often is how Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, how do they really hurt real people? You know, and that's the argument that they tend to make, that we're great for consumers. You know, all the problems that you're raising, you know, are detached from the way that all of these companies really benefit everyday people. And I think for those of us that were watching your investigation closely and watching the hearings, the answer to that is quite clear. But it's still a question that we're hearing regularly as kind of momentum towards addressing the power of these kind of corporations mounts. So I wanted to just hear how you talk about the ways in which these corporations harm everyday people, how you talk about it in your district with your constituents, and kind of make those connections between monopolies, corporate power, particularly in the technology sector, and the lived experiences of everyday Americans.
Yeah, it's a really important point. And, you know, when I talk to constituents about this, I always make the point that there's a reason that we have, from the very founding of this country, supported policies that promote competition, because we recognize that competition is a value to communities because it promotes innovation, which means new ideas, new products, more entrepreneurship. It promotes more consumer choice so that people have options. It promotes higher quality as people compete for customers and consumers. And the absence of that means that there is less choice, less innovation, less opportunities for consumers, less entrepreneurship. So it's bad for the economy, it's bad for individuals. But in the context of the technology platforms, there's something even more pernicious, because these companies have become largely data collection organizations. And so there's also privacy issues and the dissemination of false information widely that are affecting the quality of our democracy. So it's not just the sale of widgets and the cost of items, but it's also beginning to really attack the foundations of a democracy, your ability to access trustworthy, reliable news, as an example. But there's a lot of evidence that people should consider the use of these platforms. People say to me all the time, but isn't it free? And I remind them, it is not free. You're paying for it with the most valuable thing you have: your time, your attention, and your personal data, which is like gold, and that is being used and monetized. And so there are a whole range of privacy issues. But in addition to that, they're collecting information that they're then using to generate enormous profits. And they're destroying competition. They're crushing competitors. They're copying products and services. And when you have the kind of market power that these platforms have, they can get away with it because people don't really have choices, because there is no competition. So there's a real cost. If you look at sort of the history of our country, this battle, and I know Matt Stoller has written about this, obviously this battle between democracy and concentrated economic power or monopolies. I mean, this has been the battle of our country, because we know concentrated economic power, particularly in a monopoly, is inconsistent with our understanding of democracy. And you look at the way the economy has skewed to benefit people at the very top, while working people have endured stagnant wages and less power in the marketplace. That's a direct result of economic concentration.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think, that's part of what was just such a sea change. And I think the thinking about antitrust and the role of Congress in particular on these issues, that, for so long we've been thinking about corporate power in terms of this narrow kind of consumer-oriented focus. And your subcommittee just widened the aperture of the way that monopoly power harms society in such a wide range of ways, whether it's small business, the success of small businesses, all the way up to democracy as a whole. And I think that was a hugely important achievement. Let me ask you one other question, and then we have quite a few popping up in the chat here, so I want to get to some of those. I think one of the most astounding things about the report and the investigation that you all pursued is that you took on 4 of the most powerful corporations in the world. They had all the lobbyists they could ever want, all the PR campaigns they could ever put together at their disposal, and yet not a single word of that report was watered down. It was just the facts, all laid out quite clear, and accountability was on every page. Can you talk about how you approached this investigation and how you resisted attempts to water down, distort, kind of politicize the findings of this report? Because I think it was quite a remarkable achievement.
Thank you. I mean, look, when this investigation began, I made it very clear that I was leading this investigation on behalf of a subcommittee that was deeply interested in this work, that we understood there was a real problem in the digital marketplace. And we wanted to study it so we would understand it well, so that we could develop good public policy that would solve the problems that we anticipated we would find. But we went into it with real integrity. It was staffed by the most extraordinary individuals I have had the privilege of working with, led by Slade Bond, Lena Khan, and a very small group of extraordinary individuals who really, protected the integrity of the work. And my commitment was that we were going to follow the evidence and, complete a report that reflected the evidence we uncovered with a set of recommendations that would actually respond to the problems we identified. And I recognize that this is going to be difficult work. As you said, we're battling some of the most powerful companies in the history of the world. And as you know, with tremendous economic power often comes tremendous political power. And so the difficult work of actually moving forward with some of these major reforms is going to be difficult, because we're battling folks and companies that have benefited enormously from the current system. And they're going to try, they have billions and billions and billions of reasons to try to protect the status quo and prevent real competition in the digital marketplace. And so this is going to be a battle about what kind of economy that we will have in this country and whether or not we really will have policies in place that promote real competition and enforce kind of anti-monopoly provisions. And so the report had to have the kind of integrity it has because this is going to be difficult work. And we knew it was important that people understood this was done honestly and carefully and thoughtfully. And these are real solutions because this will be a battle with the titans, as they say, in terms of actually moving this legislation forward.
That's terrific. Let me ask a couple other questions. This one that just popped up in the chat dovetails with one of mine. Question is, we always seem to be dealing with monopoly issues and monopolistic companies after they've accumulated their power and done their damage by reducing choice and competition. What are your thoughts on how we get in front of monopolists attempting to extend their dominance into new markets versus having to wait until the damage is already done? I think that's a great question, and your report actually speaks to that with a lot of the reforms that you're laying out that would cut across sectors to revitalize antitrust law more generally. But would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, that getting in front of monopolists is really key. And that's why one of the things we do in the report is that we look backwards, but we also, it's very much a forward-looking document in terms of making sure that we put into place a set of reforms that will prevent the kind of monopolization that we identified in these 4 platforms. But I think it's also very important that we have, kind of clear rules of the road and that people understand what the kind of policy requirements are. And that's why some of the recommendations we make are things like structural separation and non-discrimination rules that will really help prevent monopolies from developing. And, lastly, the thing I mentioned in my opening remarks is, we also made reference to really needing aggressive antitrust enforcement and making certain that agencies are properly resourced to do this complicated work and to litigate these cases when necessary, and also that they're staffed and led by people who are sufficiently enthusiastic and creative about the work to actually do it. So, I think in fairness, the reason that this has happened in large part is because the Congress has not done, and administrations, frankly, have not done their job of good oversight, of updating antitrust statutes and making sure that we are providing resources that are necessary to actually do this work.
Fantastic. Let me ask you a couple of other questions that are coming up in the conversation. I think there's 2 that are pretty obvious. One is your comments and thoughts on the case yesterday filed by the DOJ. And I think we saw this morning that it's likely that state AGs in the coming weeks are going to file their own case. So I think looking forward ahead to 2021, when we're seeing this kind of crescendo of antitrust action that's particularly focused on Google, but I think likely to cover some of the other corporations that you investigated. How do you see that landscape coming together, particularly if there's a change of administration? But it really does feel like we're at a point where this is snowballing and we're likely to see legislation that would get at the root power of these corporations, antitrust cases filed in a variety of forums, and then potentially a new administration that can take a kind of reinvigorated approach. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's important to recognize that the Department of Justice action yesterday is a significant development. It's an important case. It is consistent with what we found during the course of our investigation, that Google is a gatekeeper and has monopoly power in search. And I think that's very clear. And that they both attain that and maintain it by using their market dominance to bully competitors, crush them, or acquire them, and that it will continue to maintain that position by engaging in other anti-competitive behavior. So I think it's very consistent with the observations we make in our report. It's important to recognize that this is an enforcement action against one company for one set of conduct, which is very important. The purpose of the investigation and the legislative proposals that are recommended is to look, to begin to solve the larger problem of the absence of competition in the digital marketplace. So both things need to keep happening. There needs to be robust enforcement from the antitrust enforcers, and that's beginning finally. It's long overdue. There's a lot more that needs to happen, and we ought to be paying close attention to that to make sure that they're using all of the tools that are currently available to them to bring restore competition in this marketplace. At the same time, the responsibility rests with Congress to make certain that the antitrust policy, the economic policy around competition is, robust and modernized and updated, and that we correct any misdirections by the courts, and that we make sure the agencies are properly resourced, and that we think about shifting some presumptions. But we set policy broadly on this space. We have not done that work for a very long time. This was the first major antitrust investigation by Congress in 50 years. So we have a lot of catching up to do. But both things need to happen. We need to have lots of robust enforcement from the enforcers. We saw one piece of one platform, one thing, which is great, but there's a lot more there on their side to do. And there's an enormous amount of work for us to do on our side in terms of good public policy and our statutory and regulatory responsibilities, as well as oversight.
Let me ask you, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions before we let you go. One of the recommendations in your report that was very important and that I want you to kind of explain to our audience here today are the list of Supreme Court precedents that you recommended Congress overturn. With the judge for the DOJ antitrust case against Google announced today, with Amy Coney Barrett's nomination pending in the Senate, can you talk a little bit about the way and the power of the judiciary, which I think is a relatively modern development as we've shifted towards thinking about consumer welfare and economic modeling to make these decisions. But the role of judiciary today in antitrust and enforcing the law versus the role of Congress and how that needs to be adjusted.
Yeah, I mean, this is one in which I think the Congress has allowed the judiciary to reset or misdirect good public policy that was intended and designed to promote competition and prevent the development of monopolies. And I think we've seen a series of court decisions that have significantly narrowed the ability of antitrust enforcers to do the work that Congress has directed them to do. And very often kind of invented out of whole cloth, not with any basis in statute or law, but just sort of some impressions of the court based on their own judgments or their, kind of their own following of particular academic arguments. And this is the responsibility of Congress to correct that. Because what happens is, is it may well be the case that antitrust enforcers begin to look at a case and they think, well, based on these standards that the court has set, or these burdens that the court has imposed, or this narrowing of what a consolidation might produce, it's going to be hard for me to prevail in bringing an antitrust action. And in fairness to the antitrust enforcers, we can demand a lot of them, but we cannot allow the courts just on their own, for a whole host of reasons, to narrow antitrust enforcement and make it almost impossible to actually promote good competition policy. So I think Congress has a responsibility to correct that in a number of ways, to make it clear what our intention is in terms of promoting competition, to give the antitrust enforcers the tools they need to effectively enforce antitrust laws and to prevent monopolies from developing and to promote competition. And we've allowed that to go on, frankly, too long. And it's time for Congress to assert its responsibilities or fulfill its responsibilities in enacting good economic policy that promotes competition and prevents monopolies from forming.
Let me ask you one last question. I think since the passage of the CARES Act and the economic crisis that we're in the midst of, we've seen the power of technology companies obviously grow and grow. And your report addresses a lot of the underlying causes of that. But we've also seen concentration across the economy accelerate in dangerous and concerning ways that I think we're going to need to reverse if we're going to establish a foundation for our economy that promotes broad-based prosperity and helps to strengthen democracy coming out of this incredibly fragile time. How are you thinking about addressing monopoly power in the ways that it is more kind of systemically established in our economy today, and building off this antitrust report to tackle that larger problem? And I know that a lot of the reforms that you propose would start to do that. They go well beyond tech, like what we just talked about. But just kind of broaden the aperture for us. How are you thinking about this going into a potential time when Biden administration is going to have to lead and design a recovery that takes into account monopoly power and the acceleration of it? over the last year in particular, on top of an already very kind of extreme time.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. And, this is an example of, we focus on the digital marketplace very intentionally in this investigation because we wanted to understand it in a way I think that was necessary to develop good policy around it. And that was the purpose of it. But look, this is a broader issue for our economy. We're seeing the kind of mega mergers and deep concentrations of economic power in a variety of sectors of our economy that pose real dangers to the health and well-being of consumers and to the health and well-being of our economy. And so I hope that this report, I know from the committee's perspective, is really just the beginning of the reassertion of robust antitrust policy and enforcement and interest by the Congress of the United States as we insist that we get the economy working again for the vast majority of people in this country. When we developed the Democratic agenda for House Democrats 2 years ago, now 3 years ago, this whole notion of the income inequality, the loss of power by workers, the loss of wages, the deep concentration of wealth at the very top, all of that was in part a result of this concentration of economic power, these mega mergers, the deepening concentration of economic power in a variety of sectors. And this is really just the beginning of that work. We have a lot to do to promote competition and promote an economy that works for everyone. And I think, whether it's in the healthcare space or in a number of other areas, the committee will lead the effort really to bring good competition policy to all of these parts of our economy because we see it as central to getting the economy to work properly so that everyone has a chance at prosperity and success, and that we can address the really pernicious consequences of income inequality and deep concentration of wealth at the very top at the expense of everyone else that have led to this deep, kind of this sense that the economy just doesn't work for regular folks anymore. And so I think we'll have a real partner in a Biden-Harris administration to do this work. And hopefully with a Democratic House, Senate, and a White House, we can actually make meaningful progress in these efforts.
Thank you so much. Again, congratulations on an incredible achievement. I think just echoing what Mike said earlier in the program, that there's this sense, this stereotype that kind of public institutions and Congress just couldn't possibly wrap their head around these problems. And not only did you all put the lie to that assumption, you laid out a path forward that would radically change the way that we do antitrust, in ways that would benefit everyday Americans, competition, democracy as a whole. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you and your team for the work that you've been doing over the last 16 months and for the road ahead, which is sure to be exciting, busy, and hopefully successful. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
All right. I want to go ahead and shift over to our panel. Morgan Harper is going to moderate that for us. Morgan recently joined Economic Liberties as a senior advisor. We're super happy to have her. She was a senior advisor at the CFPB, working with leadership there. She was a vice president at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, and most recently, she got straight into politics herself, running as a progressive candidate in Ohio's 3rd District in Columbus. So we're grateful to have her on our growing team and excited for the conversation. So I will turn it over to Morgan to introduce our 2 other panelists. Thanks, Morgan.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Great to be here. And yes, we're excited to have our panel. I want to first welcome David Heinemeier Hansson, who's the creator of Ruby on Rails, a web development platform, and one of the founders and CTO of Basecamp, and also participated in one of the subcommittee's hearings and has a lot of views on big tech and their market power. So thanks for being here, David. Jonathan Kanter, he's a former co-chair of the Antitrust group at Paul Weiss and recently started his own firm and is a leading antitrust lawyer, represented a lot of clients in connection with high-profile mergers before the Department of Justice and the FTC. So thank you, Jonathan, for being here as well. And Sarah's going to stay in our panel, but everybody already knows who she is. So David, I'm going to start with you. So as an entrepreneur and innovator, you've run up against monopoly power directly. Can you share a little bit about your experience and why carrying out the recommendations from the subcommittee's report are so important for the business community at large, but the tech industry specifically?
Sure. So when I appeared in front of the congressional hearing in earlier this year, I was there as an observer of the industry, simply noting all the ways in which small and medium-sized businesses in particular get squeezed by these big platforms. And then a few months later, I had my own business-wise near-death experience dealing with Apple and their attempt to squash our new product. And it really just brought all these things home, that we live on their lands. And it is a very uncertain place to live, and it feels unjust. It feels like a constant amount of stress that our business can disappear essentially from one day to the next if these kings of the digital platforms decided out of spite, out of negligence, out of any of the other impulses they might have to do what they do. And then we end up as business people, as creators, feeling like there is just nothing we can do. And there's nothing more frustrating than when you pour your heart and soul into creating something new, think you have a great idea and you want to get something to market, you invest the time, you invest the money, you invest your life into this. And then you face just the prospect of getting shut down, not because consumers didn't like what you made, not because you got rejected in the marketplace, not even because you got beaten by a better competitor, but simply because the platforms you are required to use in order to access the market decide to shut you out or shut you down. And that is simply just completely untenable. I've been running a digital business for the past 20 years. And for much of that time, it felt like a golden land of opportunity, exactly because the internet blew open the doors and blew away the gatekeepers, and we could sell directly to consumers. And then unfortunately, in the past 10 years in particular, the internet has really been narrowing in and it's been fenced off, and all this open land we used to have is no longer there because it's being controlled by a handful of companies who dominate everything.
And just one follow-up question. I mean, was it controversial for you? I know you started this Facebook free campaign when you started speaking out about these things, participating in the hearing. If you could talk a little bit about the reaction from industry, and are you alone in this?
Absolutely not alone. It looks a little lonely because there are so few people who are willing to speak out, because they know from experience, either directly on their own company or from watching others, that the companies who speak out, they usually face retribution or worse, and that their company's whole livelihood can disappear from one day to the next if they somehow manage to anger one of these big tech companies. So most companies, rightfully so, are not interested in running that risk. So when we started speaking out, whether it was about Facebook or it was about Google or it was about Apple, we've spoken out about pretty much all of the companies that have been investigated. Usually what that happens is I get a flood of response from other entrepreneurs who in private tell me, oh yeah, we faced this too. We got shut out, we got kicked out. What can we do? And there's just this sense of actually desperation and despair from lots of entrepreneurs who feel like they have nowhere to turn, because if they speak out, then they will be locked out of the industry forever. Now, for a variety of reasons, maybe because we're foolish, maybe because we've been around long enough, maybe because we've made the money we need to make, kind of didn't feel like we needed to shut up because of that. That as I said in the run-in we had with Apple about the hate incident, we will burn the company down before we subject to shakedowns, before we subject to any of these other oppressions from big tech and these monopolists. And I think that this is what we need. We need just these glimmers of hope to show other companies this is not impossible. You can speak out. There are actually people who are interested in listening, both in the media, both in other places, and in Congress and regulators. There are actually people who are interested in this. And I think that this is really the tide change that we've seen in just the last couple of years. I've been speaking out about this for a long time now, and for a long time, we couldn't even get consumers to care, because as Sarah was asking the question about how do we make consumers care about it? Aren't these companies just great? Thankfully, that has changed. Like, we're no longer in a place where everyone just thinks it's wonderful, whatever big tech puts out, and just because it's free, it means it's great, which used to be the case, right? So that has changed. And then there's all this wonderful activity happening, not just in the US, but in Europe and and other places, which gets this sense that like, okay, maybe here now is a moment. Now we can take a stand. Now we can do something. There's a little crack in the armor. And that's often how you take down these abusers. They seem impenetrable right until there's a crack. And that crack eventually grows large enough that we can actually do something fundamental about it.
Yeah, and I think the subcommittee's report is giving people a lot of that optimism that there is something that can be done. So Jonathan, turning to you, could you talk us through a little bit about what the plan of action here that the subcommittee is laying out, the multiple strategies that they're talking about implementing to do something about this extreme market power?
Sure, and thank you again for having me today. So the report is really a transformative document, and frankly, the whole process leading up to the report has really transformed the debate in a significant and meaningful way. And so when I look at that report, it says a few things to me. First, it's extremely important that they laid out a substantive case for enforcement. And the report did that extremely effectively. It didn't just rely on assumptions, it relied on facts, it relied on internal documents. It provided the level of oversight necessary to say, one, there's a problem, two, that the problem hasn't been addressed effectively until now, and three, in light of that, what can we do going forward? And the recommendations are comprehensive because the problem is quite massive. So first, one of the things that struck me in laying it out, and I think it's important not to lose sight of, is there's something we can fix right now, and that builds on what we saw yesterday. We have laws. Those laws are in place. Let's enforce them, and let's enforce them regularly, with vigor, with passion, creativity, and meaning. And so, that is something that could change tomorrow, just like it and just like it did yesterday, and just like the state AGs and others are planning to do with respect to Google, but other companies as well. Second is, and Chairman Cicilline talked about this, is explaining that courts have got it wrong, right? Courts, and it's quite interesting because a lot of the judiciary who have eroded antitrust enforcement often decry the idea of judicial activism. But when it comes to antitrust, many of those judges have engaged in probably the worst example of judicial activism in the history of this country, which is taking their own subjective views, often quite narrow, about economics and imposing them on the law rather than interpreting the law as Congress wrote it and achieving the objectives that were clearly stated by Congress when it enacted the law. And so clarifications may be necessary. Now, that shouldn't come at the expense of enforcement in the short term, but clarifications may be necessary to understand exactly how the law is intended to be enforced and should be enforced. And that's an extremely important solution. A number of other suggestions were really important. For example, explaining the root cause of a lot of these problems. Our economy has shifted dramatically over the last decade. And it's important that we tackle modern problems with modern tools and a modern viewpoint. But a lot of them can be, really traced back to conflicts of interest. That's why these are not just products and services that are being offered, they're platforms. That's why we call them platform. They're supposed to exist so others can build on that platform and provide benefits to consumers and society and democracy. And what we have is a situation where those platform competitors also compete on their own platforms. And it starts to create these massive conflicts of interest, many of which, not all, but have led to a lot of the problems identified in this report. And so the specificity around some of the prescriptive solutions, like addressing those kinds of issues, is really important. Also, predictability, right? I mean, it's interesting because if you look back to the 1980s and 70s when Robert Bork and the consumer welfare standard started to gain traction, there was this notion that the antitrust laws were too politicized and too opaque and uncertain, and there needed to be predictability. Now we're in a world where mergers can take a year and a half to review, millions of pages of documents, economic models that provide very little certainty. And so all the things that were supposed to provide predictability have actually had the exact opposite effect. They've created bloat in the process, and companies, businesses who rely on antitrust enforcement, like David and others, have no predictability regarding enforcement. To the extent they have any predictability, unfortunately, it's that the laws won't be enforced. And so the kinds of rules and bright lines that the committee talked about are going to be very important to impose a level of predictability so businesses can operate with certainty, and so that competitors and society can operate understanding what the antitrust laws actually mean and why they're important.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And Sarah, turning to you, could you talk a little bit about, and I know Chairman Cicilline touched on this a bit, but the significance of the report right now? I mean, there's clearly a larger anti-monopoly movement going on and addressing the impacts of consolidated corporate power. How does the report fit into that? And kind of how can people plug in? Because I do think, and we're seeing this a bit in the questions, folks have some anxiety about the urgency. Are the laws going to be able to move quickly enough? And how does this reflect on that movement?
Yeah, that's a good question. And before I turn to that, I just want to emphasize something that David said in his remarks. He said that he hears from entrepreneurs when he speaks out that they're experiencing the same problems, that they're facing the same challenges, that they're facing the same abuses from dominant platforms. And I just want to kind of make the point that monopolies aren't just bad because they raise prices, aren't just bad because they can depress wages, aren't just bad because, they can cheat competitors and kind of abuse a competitive process for their own advantage. They are bad because they instill this culture of fear in workers and in businesses and have the power to unilaterally retaliate without previously much of any recourse coming from public officials at the FTC or elsewhere that are intended to protect them against that kind of bullying. And that's something that we hear all the time, both from people in tech and different kind of sectors of the economy, that there is a culture of fear because of the systemic monopolization that we have seen that prevents people from exercising their ability and their freedom to speak out against these problems. And so I think one of the accomplishments of this report and of what Chairman Cicilline has accomplished and what his subcommittee has accomplished is a vehicle and a trust, right, between those his subcommittee in Congress and people in the small business sector, entrepreneurs, where they know that they have someone that's fighting hard, that will stand up to these corporations and that's not afraid to take them on. And I think that's a really important just kind of cultural dynamic that, I know we've heard plenty of stories of people who've experienced this sort of abuse, who've gone to enforcement agencies and not received relief or otherwise not been dealt with in ways that they thought were appropriate. And I think that is really changing. And the role of people like David in speaking out and risking their own livelihood and what they've been building for years, if not decades, to do that is, I think, heroic and notable. So I just want to put that on the table. I think what we've seen in general is that there's just not going to be any going back to how things used to be. I think that the general public is now aware and engaged around questions of monopoly and corporate power, and that in fact the economic crisis has just re-emphasized that in a tragic but I think hard to avoid way. I think that when you look at members of Congress, when you look at kind of rising leadership in agencies, when you look at academia, there is now, I think, no question that there is a movement of people who recognize the systemic nature of monopolization, the broad range of harms, not just on economic issues like we talked about, but on political issues. I'm not talking about a partisan way, but like political issues in terms of speaking out, freedom of speech, those sorts of things. And that's all, I think, going to build towards a dynamic in which there is political will to make some of these changes, both in Congress and among enforcers. And we're obviously already seeing that, I think, with the DOJ suit yesterday, and then what's going to be coming down soon with the state AGs. So from my perspective, it is a question of how fast and not whether. Obviously, we're in a moment of a lot of political uncertainty, which will affect those calculations. But I think, you know, the congressman said, this investigation is something that hasn't been done in 50 years. And I think the success of it, I think the breadth and level of detail and the integrity of the report set an inspiring and important example of how we can start to deconcentrate our economy, to understand different industrial systems, to begin learning about these issues in ways that will lay the groundwork to make progress, whether that's in Congress, which I think we anticipate, given I think some of the bipartisan opportunities there, through kind of reinvigorated enforcement agencies, and then through the powers that states have, not just states, even, you know, local city councils and things like that. This problem is so big and broad. There's lots of ways to dive in, and you know, I think part of the challenge is just you know, making sure that we can use all those resources and push all those resources to the best of our ability and quickly.
Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, I'm glad you went back to David's comments, because I think, I don't know, David, if you're seeing in the chat, but it's eliciting a lot of responses. It's clearly, it is very emotional because it is bullying, right? And I think we're hearing from some folks who run their own companies that want to know what can they do now. And connected to that, you know, I think in addition to maybe thoughts you have on individual actions, if you could speak a little bit about your vision for what a fair tech industry would look like, that one that's honoring innovation, but then also protecting consumer rights and leaving room for smaller businesses.
Yeah, I think first of all, the fact that there now is a broad, almost coalition of forces shining a light on this provides some cover, right? Most people are afraid to speak out when they're going to be the first person to step forward. They're no longer the first person to step forward. There's a broad attention to this from the media and from a lot of other areas to provide some cover. At least that is the hope. So I'd say encourage people to share those stories, either share them directly with journalists or publish them themselves, such that we just get a broader understanding from both the industry and legislators and regulators who look at it, that this is really a widespread problem. One of the issues we sometimes have in the tech industry in particular is we have this feeling like everyone knows there's a problem. Everyone knows and no one is doing anything. Do you know what? Everyone doesn't know. There is so much more and it's so much deeper than I think we've even begun to realize. So we need to clarify this. We need to get it all out there. And then in terms of the vision for a fair tech system, I think the most important thing for me is to kind of hope that this does not just turn out to be another lame fine, right? Like Facebook gets fined $5 billion, which is basically just like, okay, whatever, 3 weeks of revenue, and now we get to do whatever we want, right? Like it puts a price tag on monopolistic behavior or bad behavior. That is the worst thing that could possibly come out of this. What we need is change of behavior. We need change in the systems. When I gave my congressional testimony in January, I tried to propose some of those things, for example, with the issues we've had with the app stores. There are very specific things you can do to encourage competition and to give companies the sense that there is a fair playing field here, that they're not just under the gun, that they don't have to just pay these highway robbery rates. If you allow companies, for example, to use their own payment processing system, that is a very concrete proposal or decree you could put upon these platforms to say, you simply must do this. You can't just set all the rules willy-nilly as you please. There must be some uniform rules and there must be a baseline of what you allow these companies to do. That's the kind of changes we need. We don't need more fines. If Google getting fined $10 billion, $50 billion, it does nothing for me. It does nothing for the other companies that are in this situation. Changes of behavior is what's going to do something.
Yeah, and Jonathan, would be interested in your reactions on that, and specifically talking about, you know, I know one of the unique things in the report coming up is the revitalization of private rights of action. So if you could just speak a little bit about how important that is and some other.
Sure. Absolutely. So first of all, I just completely agree with all of the comments about David's courage. It means so much, and it gives others the ability to have courage to come forward. And it's not an easy thing to do. One observation I will make is that lack of enforcement leads folks to think that there's no reason to come forward. And we saw that after the FTC closed its investigation of Google in early 2013. A lot of companies spent a lot of time, money, resources, and frankly risked their business confronting a giant, only to have it go away with a press conference that praised the target of the investigation. And after that, it was very difficult for companies to devote the resources. They felt it was futile. Now, thanks to a movement and a greater recognition of a problem, and people like David, frankly, folks are coming forward. But if we don't seize the moment, and if we don't actually see enforcement as a result of this activism, then folks are going to withdraw once again. And so we have this moment, we have a report, we have investigations, we have the public with us, we have industry with us. We need to see real enforcement, and we need to see it faster. The antitrust enforcement process has become extremely long and expensive, and consumes massive amounts of resources. We should be able to enforce the law more efficiently and more quickly. In terms of private rights of action, one of the issues I guess that I have is that and there have been some recent exceptions which are encouraging, but most of the private rights of action or private actions in antitrust have really been provided or come from large plaintiffs firms with contingency fee agreements looking for big rewards and settlements. And that's fine, and it serves an important purpose. But I think we need a better system where companies like David's, who are actually seeking change, for example, with Apple's App Store policies, can get that change through the judicial system as well as through the government enforcement quickly and without having to spend $50 million in litigation fees and being dragged through the mud. There's got to be a better way to do this. And so I think to the extent that we focus on private rights of action, it's important to make sure that the folks who are harmed are getting the relief that they need, not just a check at the end.
I want to note something that you said that I hadn't thought about before, was that for an enforcement system supposedly designed around efficiency, it is remarkably and almost comically inefficient and expensive. So
yeah, I mean, it could take over a year to investigate a merger, years to investigate conduct. You have to hire, the agencies spend a lot of money hiring outside economists. They're looking at, you take 50 staff lawyers to do a big case. That's not efficient, and it's not an effective enforcement mechanism. There has to be a way to do it better, faster. And even if that means shifting more of the burden to after you file the litigation and having a judge oversee discovery, then so be it. But there has to, we're not going to see the kind of enforcement that we all desire unless there's an efficient way for enforcers to go about it.
I'd add one point there, which is there's also not an efficient way to use the legal system as a defense when you're getting squashed. We literally looked into this with the Hague case. What would it cost us to go through the legal system to protect our business from Apple killing us? And the answer was, you have a great case. It's going to take 3 years to get to the first spot, and you're going to look at a decade's worth of legal action before you get to the end. And yeah, the price tag is probably going to be somewhere between $20 and $50 million. Are you interested in signing up? Who's going to sign up for 10 years in court and tens of millions of dollars to just get relief on of a defensive measure? It's completely bust and broken.
Yeah, so that's one follow-up question, I guess. It's just what makes this different? I mean, I know one question we're getting that we've had comments on in the chat is, oh, but their stock prices are still strong and just business as usual. So why is this different? Another question I'm going to loop in to try to address what folks are bringing up, how important it is to be coordinating with international regulation. Would love the panel's thoughts on that, kind of to everybody.
I think just to point on the stock prices, I think the market is simply telling us that they don't believe that anything is going to come of this. And why would they? As Cicilline said, that nothing has happened in 50 years. Like, the safe money would be that like, this is all not going to amount to anything. It's going to amount to a lot of words. It's not going to amount to a lot of action. And these are still great, safe investments because this is a sort of economic consolidation that's ongoing. Like Apple alone went from being a $1 trillion company to a $2 trillion company in how many months? Not very many at all, right? So the smart money is betting that nothing's going to come of this. And I just hope that they're wrong.
Yeah, I guess I'll add on that by saying enforcement breeds change, right? And so little anecdote. I mean, I started my career at the FTC, and then I was in private practice, and I came out to private practice during the heyday of the Microsoft case. And at the time, most of the assignments as a relatively young lawyer I got were relating to companies who wanted to make sure that they weren't going to run in the same into the same kind of antitrust battle that Microsoft ran into. They wanted to make sure that they weren't monopolizing the law. Fast forward, 10 years, 15 years, nobody was calling with those kinds of questions because nobody was scared rather, or concerned that there would be any enforcement. Now, fast forward another, 5 to 10 years, and we see the report, we see cases being developed against big tech companies. And now all of a sudden, folks start people in industry and saying, well, maybe enforcement might take place. And so if we can see a sea change in how much enforcement activity we have, we're going to see companies change how they do business. And that's extremely important for deterrent value and to convince companies and market participants that complying with the antitrust law is good for business. It's good for stock price. It's good for their consumers. It's good for their ecosystem participants. And ultimately, as a society, we can say it's good for democracy.
Yeah, and I'll just add kind of one point to that, picking up on something I think Jonathan said earlier, which is just the kind of built-in arbitrary nature of addressing some of these problems in the way that we are kind of currently set up to do so. There's not predictability for business, right? It's not easy and efficient to enforce the law. There are no bright line rules that kind of focuses on market share or other questions that could give businesses predictability and eliminate some of the bloat that Jonathan described so well. When you kind of unpack it, it's all just a bit silly, right? That it's just so difficult to kind of enforce the law and bring predictability into these markets in ways that would benefit startups, benefit entrepreneurs, benefit smaller businesses, rather than deferring to the interests of the largest kind of corporations in the world. And we've seen the effect of that. So sometimes it feels like there needs to be a little common sense brought into this conversation, and a set of values that actually kind of prioritizes a dynamic economy, prioritizes smaller businesses and startups. And I think one other thing that's important to note is around breakups and restructuring and actually driving towards, which the chairman's report did, driving towards actually addressing the power kind of at its root and creating competition. And I'm not an economist, but I have learned early on that if you want more competition in a market, generally you just need more competitors, right? And so I think we need to understand and become less afraid of this idea that either through Congress's ability to legislate or enforcement actions, we are going to have to break up some companies. Like, we should probably start with the big four here that we're talking about. But that level of political power, right, is just unsustainable, especially if you're trying to craft a regulatory regime to kind of fit around them, right, in ways that I think previously would be described as elegant, but in general are like easy to game. So I think the fact that just this conversation and the evolution of it over the last year or 2 years has brought that into focus, that power is a really important question here. And without addressing that power through breakups in particular, and addressing conflicts of interest like Jonathan described, it's going to be very, very hard to create a commercial environment in which companies like David's can be successful on the merits.
Great. Well, and I wanted to take some time too to focus on one action that we've already been referencing a little bit, the Google lawsuit, to get the panel's thoughts on that. Do you all see this as stemming from the activity of the subcommittee, what are your thoughts on the scope, which also a comment that we had in the chat. And Jonathan, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I think this is all a function of the movement, right? And I think the subcommittee report, is, being among them, and the investigation, not just the report, but the investigation being so critical, and courage from people like David and others who have spoken out publicly and others privately before the agencies. So, I think this is the product of years of work. I started working on Google issues back in 2007, and it was extremely hard to get people to pay attention back then. Now it's a lot easier, but it took that hard work to kind of climb up the mountain, and now it's much easier to go downhill. So, in terms of the importance, it's quite significant. Again, it's a starting point. There will be more actions, and there need to be more actions. And I'm very interested to see what the state attorneys general do next. But I commend the Department of Justice for bringing an important case and for talking about structural relief. And it was a well-played complaint. It talks about the impact on businesses. It talks about the impact on consumers. It talks about the impact on privacy. Again, there's more work to be done, a lot more work. But I think now we're in a world where all of a sudden these issues start to become real. We're not talking about whether somebody's going to bring a case. We're talking about the case that's been made. And so the more cases we have, the more real it will become. And hopefully all of them will go to victory, including the case that was just filed by the Department of Justice. Some may not. But again, the lack of enforcement has and litigated decisions has created a world in which folks are using their imagination to figure out the boundaries of the antitrust laws rather than using decisions by courts to understand what works and what doesn't.
David?
I'd say the one concern I sit with is this concern that, is this the one shot? Is this the one shot we get at it? And if it is it A, good enough? Is it broad enough? Or is this it? Because if this is it, then great, something is happening, but it's also quite narrow. It doesn't talk about app stores at all. It's quite narrowly focused on just the search and ad monopolies. And there's so many issues, and we need relief on all of them. So it's a tempered enthusiasm for the fact that something is happening, but also how long was this case underway? And then that this is the narrowness of it. Is it going to take us, another 5 years to develop and the other cases we need to develop? I think that's some of the uncertainty that we sit with, but I mean, great that something is happening at least.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the panelists for joining us. If anyone has any final thoughts that they want to lob out there, Sarah, maybe close us out, and then we'll transition to Commissioner Chopra.
Yeah, I'll just kind of follow up on what David said there. I think one of the kind of elements of this particular political moment that gives me optimism is, one, you do have action moving in different theaters. You have action in Congress, and I think Congressman Cicilline is committed to moving forward legislation that would address some of these problems, which, again, like you mentioned, hasn't been done in a very long time, and laid out a terrific and comprehensive blueprint for doing that. You have agencies kind of waking up and looking at the need to turn the page from the way that this has been done for the last 40 years and the consequences of those choices. And then you just have a much more substantial public awakening in the political moment, right? That kind of cushions all of these actions and helps to fuel them forward. So, I think coming out of the DOJ case yesterday, I think most people's reaction was really similar to David's. Like, this is long overdue. It's an important step, but it is one part of what needs to be a comprehensive approach just for dealing with this one corporation and the power and scope that we've allowed it to amass. And then we have to kind of translate that into other corporations too, not just Facebook, not just Amazon, not just Apple, but we need to look in agriculture, in banking, in broadband, in healthcare, right? It is a little bit daunting when you start to go down the list, but we have a blueprint, and I think we have the kind of transformation in consciousness to guide the way. And no doubt it is not a moment too soon. We are kind of deep in a serious crisis of economic concentration. But I think the vision that is now firmly established is correct. And the path forward, as Chairman Cicilline laid out, will start the process of getting us there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, Jonathan, for joining us. We really appreciate your insights. And as we know and have discussed, this is going to be an ongoing movement. So we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you.
Thank you. And thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, now we're going to turn to closing remarks from Commissioner Rohit Chopra of the Federal Trade Commission. Commissioner Chopra is a consumer advocate, and he was previously an assistant director at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the agency's first student loan ombudsman. So Commissioner Chopra, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Morgan. And this was a really great discussion. Let me just start by saying that obviously the action of the past few weeks is such an important milestone in the broader quest for corporate accountability, particularly for the biggest and richest actors in our economy. And one of the things that I think I'm taking away is that we're obviously going to need Congress to do a lot. Congress makes our laws and they can fix a lot of our laws too. But it also is going to put a lot of responsibility on agencies like the FTC, like the DOJ, like the FCC. We can do things now within our own mandate under existing law, and we should. We want to see Congress update laws for the modern era, but that doesn't mean we should wait to act ourselves. So I'll just share a couple things that are high on my mind of a few steps I think the FTC and other regulators have to take. And the first is we need to end the era of weak enforcement. Chairman Cicilline talked about this. A lot of this is about the individuals and agencies who are willing to pursue meaningful enforcement. But what have we seen, particularly when it comes to big tech? Take the FTC's YouTube settlement. Looks like a big headline fine, but in my analysis, it looked like YouTube actually made money on the illegal conduct. And for me, that's not a penalty, that's an incentive to do it again. Take the FTC's Facebook settlement, where we believe Facebook violated its FTC order from 2012 almost immediately and repeatedly. And what did the settlement have? No changes to Facebook's business model, particularly its behavioral advertising model, but it had a release for Mark Zuckerberg, for Sheryl Sandberg, that gave them complete immunity for any role they may have had. A settlement with a fine and some paperwork is not going to fix the problem. It's only going to incentivize bad behavior going forward. And the list can go on and on. We need to make sure that we end this era of enforcement that we've pursued and really look at all the tools that the agencies have, not just at the FTC, but across the board. We cannot have a go-it-alone approach. We need to be using all the laws we have on the books, including the ban on unfair deceptive practices and the ban on unfair methods of competition together in the data and tech economy. We need to be working more closely with state attorneys general, with other regulatory agencies, and we have to make sure that criminal law enforcement is at the table when we think criminal laws have been broken. The second thing I want to mention is we need to cut down on conflicts of interest that are inherent in some of these business models. One of the most interesting parts of the Cicilline report was the recommendation regarding structural separations. That is the ability to separate certain types of business activities that may have inherent conflicts of interest. And we've seen throughout history in the US that dominance in one market can be used to create dominance in another and another and another. This is not how an economy should work. The ones who prosper should be the ones with the best ideas, the best vision, the best products, the best customer service. It can't just be about corporate royalty with conflicted business models that can squeeze rents out of anything they touch. And instead of complex behavioral remedies, we may need to think of clear structural separations. And I think that Congress and the regulators are going to need to take a very close look at that recommendation. The third is we need to unwind anti-competitive corporate concentration in our economy. I think there's simply no question that when it comes to the regulator's record, many agencies have simply missed out on some of the worst and most anti-competitive transactions over the last generation. And that's not just about looking at those mergers and transactions again. It's also about auditing the agency's models and tools to see if our prediction capabilities are ever working in the first place. You know, one of my criticisms of the analysis that we undertake is it simply doesn't fit the modern market realities of today's capital markets that involve everything from share buybacks and private equity. We don't live in a textbook economy, and we need to make sure that our tools and models and our analysis are in the 21st century, not in some dated reality. Another thing I want to mention is we need to restrict some outrageous and anti-competitive contract clauses. You know, the FTC has a long history when it comes to putting a stop to the use of certain contract terms. It's been done in law enforcement actions. It's been done through rulemaking. And we need to really explore how dominant players can use take it or leave it contract terms to coerce, to bully, and to take more parts of the economic pie than they really deserve. We hear so much when it comes to how platforms invoke most favored nation clauses. We hear everything about app stores, and the list goes on and on. But contract terms are a way that big, powerful firms can squeeze small businesses and entrepreneurs in ways that are harmful to our entire economy, particularly when it comes to innovation and new technologies. And fifth, we need to really restore rigor through real industry monitoring. It's been about a generation since the FTC has cut off some of its main ways of collecting data about the economy and monitoring markets. The line of business surveys that took place were real insights on how concentration in the economy was evolving and shaping. Until we are willing to gather fulsome amounts of data on what's really happening in the economy, instead of simply relying on paid-for economists representing powerful interests who have all the incentive to tell a story that suits their client. Independent research, data gathering, and rigorous analysis have to be part of any way to modernize antitrust and law enforcement in this country. So we have tools. We can do things now. Some of the most promising of the tools we have today is Section 6B of the FTC Act, the ability to conduct industry-wide investigations and studies and compel data, and we should use it. We have rulemaking under the FTC Act's prohibition on unfair methods of competition. I was really honored to co-author a piece with Professor Lena Khan about how to resuscitate its use. And we have so many other authorities just in the FTC Act that really can restore credibility and meaning to how we are watchdogs over today's markets. So, Morgan, I'll stop there, but I'll say this. We've got a lot that Congress has to do. We have a lot for the agencies to do, but we also have a lot that all of you have to do, to ask the hard questions, to write and to analyze the problems in the market so that we can figure out who is getting away with misconduct, stop it, and hold them accountable for it. So, thanks again to AELP and everyone who made this event possible. And I'm just really excited for all that we can achieve.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Chopra, for joining us again in those remarks. And thank you everyone who made our session today possible. First, the chairman, Cicilline, Congressman Cicilline, and the subcommittee for their very comprehensive report, and the staff that led the investigation and put it together. All of our panelists and the Omidyar network for supporting this work, and all of you for joining us. And please do continue to follow along. We're at economicliberties.us, and we will have much more to come. Thank you.